Hi class, we're going to finish up the chapter 4 lecture. So if you get out your study guide from chapter 4, I believe we stopped on this slide when we were in class. So we filled out the microscope chart, and now we are on this slide, which is the last concept question on the first page of your study guide, where it says, what 4 basic features do all cells have in common? They all have plasma membrane, DNA, ribosomes, and cytosol or cytoplasm. Some books use the word cytosol, some cytoplasm, so those are interchangeable. Now, also the first concept question, what is the basic building block of all living organisms? That's going to be the cell, which is also on this slide. If you go up to the top where we have the terms, I'd also like you to define cytosol and cytoplasm, so you can define that up there. Now I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so this should be review from chapter 1, but we have the 2 major categories of cells, and we got to see these in the microscope lab. So if you switch to page 2 of your study guide, what are the main differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells? So that's going to be on the next slide, but I just want to have you remember that prokaryotic cells are bacteria, and eukaryotic cells are going to be plants, animals, fungi, and protists. So the good memory trick for that is you, like Y-O-U, are a eukaryotic cell. So on this slide, we have the main differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So we've got, you can see my cursor here. Obviously, this is much smaller. So prokaryotic cells, bacteria, are much smaller. Eukaryotic cells are larger. Prokaryotic are simpler, and they lack most organelles. They also do not have a nucleus. Their DNA is kind of in this nucleoid region, but it does not have a nuclear membrane that separates it from the rest of the cell. So the eukaryotic cell, much larger, more complex. It contains many types of organelles, and that's what we're going to focus on kind of the rest of the chapter, is looking at what the eukaryotic cell has inside of it. So if we look at prokaryotic cells, they come in many shapes. So we'll be looking at this further in chapter 15, but I do not have it in the study guide this time, but we will talk about these next time. So you've got the 3 different kinds of shapes. You've got spherical, called cocci, rod-shaped, or bacilli, and spirals, are spirochetes. If you've ever had strep throat, you've got that cocci, streptococci. E. coli in your gut are going to be the little pickle-shaped bacilli. And the spirochetes are going to be like this organism that causes Legionnaire's disease. That's a more, well, it's not as common as cocci and bacilli. So if we look at the prokaryotic bacteria, you can see it does not have a nucleus, but it has this DNA kind of crammed region, but there's no membrane that separates the nucleoid region from the rest of the bacteria. But you can see it also has a plasma membrane, and it also has flagella. We're going to talk about those in a second, and we'll define those later. Okay, so let's look at our eukaryotic cell. Our next question in the study guide says, what structures are found in animal cells but not plant cells? And then what structures are found in plant cells but not in animal cells? So up in this corner, this is an animal cell, And up in this corner, we see the items that are only found in animal cells and not in plant cells. So that includes the centriole, the lysosome, and the flagellum. Now, just so you can finish this question, I'm going to flip to the next page. So this is a plant cell, and the items that are in plant cells but not in animal cells include the central vacuole, the cell wall, and the chloroplast. Now the cell wall is outside of the plasma membrane. In this picture, this very thin yellow layer here, that's the plasma membrane, and that's what all cells have. And then plant cells have a cell wall outside of that. Okay, so in a few minutes, we'll be talking about all of these different components of the cell, and most of the items are in both types of cells. So let's start talking a little bit about the plasma membrane first. Now, a reminder, the plasma membrane is in both eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. So your next question on your study guide, briefly describe the function of the plasma membrane in cells. So it's basically to separate the cell from its non-living environment. So it just separates the living from the non-living. Your next question asks, what is the plasma membrane composed of? Include its structure and the 3 points brought up on the slides. So this is not the answer. We're going to get into more detail, but on a basic level, cell membranes are going to be composed of lipids and proteins. If you look at this slide, we've got the outside of the cell, we've got the inside of the cell, and we've got this phospholipid bilayer. So point number 1 on your study guide is that the plasma membrane is composed of a phospholipid bilayer. What does that mean? So we've got these little lipids that, if you remember, they're going to be, lipids are these tails right here. The lipids are hydrophobic, meaning they do not like water. So inside the cell is going to be water, outside of the cell is going to be water. So the lipid parts try to stay away from the water, so they face inside. So that's the hydrophobic inner part of the plasma membrane. On the outside, facing either the outside of the cell or the cytoplasm, is going to be the hydrophilic head, and this is the phospho part. So the first point to know is that the plasma membrane has a phospholipid bilayer. And then the second thing to know is that this phospholipid bilayer has specific proteins embedded in it. So if you look here, we've got our phospholipid bilayer with the phosphate heads going to be yellow colored. We've got our lipids facing inside. We've got the double layer. And then this giant thing that looks like an eggplant is going to be a protein. Now, the thing to know about this is not like a solid thing. You can actually, the proteins can move around in this phospholipid bilayer. So say this protein needs to interact with this protein, they can actually move through here to get to each other. I like to use the analogy of, if you've ever seen one of those ball pits in like McDonald's or Chuck E. Cheese, and the kids are in the ball pit, you can think of the ball pit as being the phospholipid bilayer, and then each kid is a protein, and then this kid wants to go play with that kid. So it can be hard to do, like when you're 2 years old and your head is barely sticking out of the ball pit, but you can gradually move over to play with your friend in the ball pit. So that's like proteins interacting here. So this is a more scientific way of saying kids in a ball pit. And then our third point is that molecules can move freely within that phospholipid bilayer. We tend to call this, you'll hear it called a fluid mosaic. I'm not going to use that term on an exam, but you might hear that from, say, a different class, a fluid mosaic. So it's basically meaning that molecules can move freely within the membrane. Okay, so this slide is showing we've got two different cells here. Here's the phospholipid layer of one. Here's the phospholipid bilayer of the other. And then the purple things again are proteins. And just knowing that proteins do all the work in our body. Okay, you can have ones that connect for cell-cell recognition. You can have transport proteins letting things in and out. You can get cell signaling from one part of the body to the next. You can have attachment to an extracellular matrix. So proteins are really doing all of our work. All right, so just looking where we are here, make sure I'm not skipping any questions. So the first thing we're going to talk about is going to be cell surfaces. So plant cells are going to have the cell walls outside of their plasma membrane, and animal cells are going to have an extracellular matrix. So if you look at your study guide, the rest of the study guide is actually listing all of the organelles. And for some crazy reason, just to mess with your head, I put these two that come first at the very end. So if you turn to page 3 and you look at the long list of organelles, the very last two, you've got cell wall and you've got extracellular matrix. So for those, you're going to want to put the definition here. So cell wall, I've told you it's only in plants. It helps protect the plant, okay? It helps maintain their shape, keep the cells from absorbing too much water. All you have to know is one of those. So protecting the cell, that works. If you look at this list, there it's on page 2 and 3 of the study guide, there are several words that have, several organelles that have asterisks in front of them. Those are the ones that I want you to be able to label on the exam. So on the exam, I'm going to go back to my pictures here. I'm going to have either this picture or this picture, and I will point to one of the organelles, and I will be using a colored picture, and it will be these pictures. And I will ask you, what is the name of this what is the name of this organelle? What is the name of this item in the cell? So the ones with the asterisks, be able to label them on a picture and be able to give me a very, very brief function. Okay, it doesn't have to be totally complete, like all these different things, but if you tell me this is the cell wall, it helps protect the cell, you're good to go. Animal cells do not have a cell wall, but they have an extracellular matrix. So you will notice that the extracellular matrix does not have an asterisk next to it, so you will not have to label that on the cell because it's actually not on our cell picture. The extracellular matrix helps hold the cells together in the tissues. It protects and supports them. Now, when something does not have an asterisk in the study guide, that doesn't mean you're never going to get asked anything about that. That might appear, say, in a multiple choice question. So I still want you to know it, but you visually do not have to label that on a cell. So this is showing you an example. We've got our phospholipid bilayer, we've got our purple proteins going on, and then you've got this extracellular matrix. Okay, so you can have proteoforms glycans, all kinds of things that at a Bio 105 level we don't need to know, but this is going to help like tissues hold together. So starting out with the nucleus and ribosomes. I've got the pictures side by side so you can see that both animal and plant cells both have these items. So now you're going to want to flip back to page 2 of your study guide, and you're going to have the nucleus. So the nucleus, you can think of that as the manager of the cell. This has the genetic control of the cell. One thing I want to point out is this entire thing is the nucleus, not this little purple ball of grapes in the middle. Okay, so this entire purple thing is the nucleus. The grapes in the middle are actually something else that we'll be talking about in a second. So the nucleus contains the genetic information of the cell. You can tell me it's the boss of the cell. The ribosomes are these little dots that appear either in the cytoplasm or connected to this endomembrane system that we'll discuss in a minute, probably on the next slide, I'm guessing. So, on the next slide, on the next video. So, what do ribosomes do? Ribosomes make proteins. Okay, so that's all you have to know for ribosomes. In a later chapter, we're going to go into more detail about that, but ribosomes make proteins. Okay, so on your study guide, skip the word nucleolus for now. We're going to talk about that in a second. So here's a close-up of the nucleus. So it's got that double membrane called the nuclear envelope. That's what makes eukaryotic cells different from prokaryotic cells. That ball of grapes that's in the middle, this is actually the nucleolus. You will not have to label that on your picture, but know that in the nucleolus is where the parts of the ribosomes are made. So let's switch to this page. So this is going to give you a bunch of definitions, and we'll probably stop here for our first video. So we've got ribosomes, they make proteins. The nucleolus is going to be that bunch of grapes in the middle of the nucleus, and that's where ribosomal subunits are made. Then we've got this word chromosomes, chromatin. That one you have to go back to the first page. And chromosomes, chromatin are your second term. So this is going to be the combination of DNA and proteins found in the nucleus of the cell. We're going to talk about that more in a different chapter. And chromosomes are basically the genetic material that are passed from parent to child. And then just to make you switch back and forth, if you go back to your second page, you've got nucleus, the genetic control center of the eukaryotic cell. Okay, so this is going to bring me to the end of video 1 for chapter 4.